There is a moment in the Gospels that has made theologians uncomfortable for 2,000 years. A woman falls at Jesus' feet. She is desperate. Her daughter is possessed, tormented and suffering. She has heard about this man who heals the sick, who commands the wind, who raises the dead. She has crossed cultural and ethnic lines that almost no one in her world would have crossed. She has done everything right. And Jesus ignores her, not for a second, not for a polite pause. He ignores her completely, and then, when he finally speaks, he says something that stops readers cold to this day. He says it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. He called her a dog, or at least that's what it looks like. But here is the thing. Almost everything you think you know about this moment is wrong. The silence, the insult, the refusal, all of it is doing something completely different from what it appears to be doing on the surface. And once you see what's actually happening, this stops being the most uncomfortable moment in the Gospels and becomes one of the most extraordinary. We are going to go through this story word by word. Every silence, every cultural layer, every Greek term that English translations have been flattening for centuries. And by the end, you will understand why this unnamed woman from Phoenicia may be the sharpest theological mind in all four Gospels. But we have to start somewhere that most people skip entirely. We have to start with why Jesus was even in that region at all, because that context changes everything that follows. To understand what happens in this story, you have to understand what happened the day before it. Matthew chapter 15 opens not with a quiet teaching on a hillside, but with a confrontation. A delegation of Pharisees and scribes has traveled from Jerusalem specifically to challenge Jesus. And when we say traveled from Jerusalem, we mean they covered somewhere between 80 and 100 miles on foot or by animal just to pick an argument about hand washing. That is not a casual trip. That is a statement. The Jerusalem establishment considered Jesus important enough and threatening enough to dispatch their best people to watch him, test him, and if possible discredit him in front of his followers. Their specific complaint is about ritual purity. Jesus' disciples eat without performing the ceremonial hand-washing that the Pharisees required. In the world of first-century Jewish religious practice, this was not a minor hygiene issue. It touched on deep questions about holiness, about who was clean and who was not, about the boundaries between Israel and the Gentile world. The Pharisees were, in many ways, the experts in these boundaries. Their whole project was about maintaining the purity of Israel in a world dominated by Rome. They were not bad people. They were serious, devout people who had built an elaborate system to keep the covenant community intact under enormous cultural pressure. And Jesus dismantles them in front of everyone. He calls them hypocrites. He quotes Isaiah directly at them, saying, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." He tells the crowds that it is not what goes into a person's mouth that defiles them, but what comes out of their heart. He is not just disagreeing with a policy, he is pulling the foundation out from under their entire theological project. Now keep that argument in your mind, because it matters enormously for what happens next. Because immediately after this confrontation, Matthew tells us Jesus withdrew. He withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And if you do not know the geography, that phrase sounds like a minor travel detail. It is not. It is one of the most loaded geographical statements in the entire Gospel. Tyre and Sidon were not simply the next town over. They were Gentile cities on the Phoenician coast, northwest of Galilee, outside the traditional boundaries of Jewish territory. For a Jewish rabbi in the first century, traveling there voluntarily was not just unusual, it was almost unthinkable. The history between Israel and the Phoenician coast went back centuries, and almost none of it was good. The prophets Amos, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Joel, all of them had delivered judgments against Tyre and Sidon. In the Hebrew scriptures, these cities represented pagan culture at its most entrenched. They were the source of the Baal worship that had nearly destroyed Israel during the reign of Ahab. Queen Jezebel, perhaps the most villainous figure in the entire Old Testament, was a Phoenician princess from Sidon. This is where Jesus goes immediately after a heated argument about who is clean and who is unclean. The deliberateness of that cannot be overstated. Mark's account adds a detail that Matthew omits. He says, Jesus entered a house there and did not want anyone to know he was there. He was exhausted. The ministry had been relentless. He was trying to rest. He was trying to disappear. But there is a word that comes next in Mark's account that changes everything. It says he could not escape notice. He could not stay hidden, because word travels fast, even across the ethnic and cultural boundaries of the first century, even into Gentile territory. The story of this teacher from Galilee who healed the sick and drove out demons had already spread far beyond the borders of Israel. And someone had been waiting. Matthew calls her a Canaanite woman. Just sit with that for a moment, because Matthew is making a deliberate and provocative choice with that word. By the first century, the Canaanites as a people had not existed for hundreds of years. They had been absorbed into the surrounding cultures long before Jesus was born. Nobody in the Roman world called themselves Canaanite. That label had disappeared from everyday usage. So why does Matthew use it? Because he is writing for a Jewish Christian audience that would have felt the weight of that word immediately. In the Hebrew scriptures, the Canaanites are the enemy. They are the people Israel was supposed to have driven out of the land. They are the source of idol worship, child sacrifice, and everything that stood in opposition to the God of Israel. Calling this woman a Canaanite was like Matthew pulling out the most extreme possible label for an outsider and applying it to her. He wants his readers to feel every layer of this woman's foreignness. He wants them to understand that, by every possible measure, she has no standing to approach Jesus. No history, no covenant, no claim. Mark, writing for a different audience, calls her a Syrophoenician Greek. That label is more precise geographically, but does similar work. She is Gentile. She is Greek-speaking. She belongs to the dominant Hellenistic culture that had spread across the Mediterranean world since Alexander the Great. She is about as far outside the covenant community of Israel as it was possible to be, and she comes screaming. That is not dramatic language. The Greek word Matthew uses, krazein, means to cry out loudly and urgently. It is used elsewhere in the Gospels to describe demoniacs, blind men on the roadside, people in states of extreme desperation. This is not the polite voice of someone requesting an appointment. She is shouting, in public, repeatedly, and what she shouts is extraordinary. "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is suffering terribly." Notice every word of that. She calls him Lord. She calls him Son of David. These are not generic honorifics. Son of David is a specifically Jewish messianic title. It is the language of Psalm 110, of the messianic expectations that saturated first-century Jewish culture. It is, in fact, the language that Jesus' own disciples were still arguing about and working through. A Canaanite woman on Gentile soil is addressing a Jewish teacher using the precise theological vocabulary that his own people were only beginning to accept. She knows exactly who she is talking to. That is not an accident. She has done her research. She has heard the stories. And she has come prepared. But Jesus says nothing. Matthew records this with brutal simplicity. He did not answer her a word, not a pause before speaking, not a moment of consideration, nothing. The silence stretches out, and it is the disciples who finally break it, asking Jesus to send her away because she won't stop following them and shouting. And that is when Jesus says the first difficult thing. He says, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." I want you to hold that line because we are going to come back to it. And when we do, it will be the most important line in the whole story. But right now, notice what the woman does with it. She doesn't accept it. She comes even closer. She kneels directly in front of him, and she reduces everything to 3 words: "Lord, help me." That is the most stripped-down prayer in the New Testament. No theology, no credentials, no argument, just a mother on her knees. And now comes the line. It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. 2,000 years of readers have stopped cold at those words. And here is the first thing you need to understand, the thing that most English readers miss entirely because it is buried in a translation decision that nobody highlights. The Greek word Jesus uses is not the word for wild dogs. In the 1st century, there were 2 completely different words for dog in Greek. The first was kion, which referred to the wild scavenging dogs that roamed the streets of ancient cities. These were dangerous, disease-carrying animals. Nobody wanted them near their home. Nobody fed them intentionally. When Jewish teachers used the word kion to refer to Gentiles, which some of them did, it was about as harsh an insult as the language allowed. Jesus does not use that word. The word he uses is kainaria. It is a diminutive form. In Greek, diminutives often carry emotional softening. Kainaria does not mean wild street curs. It means small dogs, household dogs, the kind that live inside, under the table, waiting for scraps from the family meal. This is not a throwaway grammatical detail. It is the entire key that unlocks the conversation. Jesus is not comparing this woman to a dangerous, diseased street animal. He is placing her inside the household, under the table, present at the meal, not eating from it yet, but there, in the room, part of the scene. And the woman catches it immediately. She does not flinch. She does not break down crying. She does not walk away in humiliation. She takes the exact image Jesus has placed before her and does something so sharp with it that the greatest theological minds of every century since have stopped to admire it. Yes, it is, Lord. Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Let me show you what she just did. Jesus presented a metaphor with a clear inside and outside. Children at the table, dogs on the floor. Israel receiving the bread, Gentiles excluded. She accepted every term of the metaphor without argument. She did not dispute that there was a table. She did not claim the right to sit at it. She did not demand equality. She found the one thing the metaphor had not accounted for. If the dogs are under the table, they are not outside the house. They are in the household. And in any household, crumbs fall. Not because the children share deliberately, but because that is how meals work. The overflow, the excess, the bits that drop while the children eat abundantly, those reach the dogs. She is not asking Jesus to deprive Israel of anything. She is asking for what falls naturally from the abundance. She is saying, your mission to Israel does not have to pause for me. I am not asking you to leave the table. I am asking for what falls while you sit at it. It is one of the great rhetorical moves in all of ancient literature. She has taken the very argument that seemed to exclude her and turned it into the argument for why she should be included. And Jesus does not try to recover the position. He concedes it completely. Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted. And her daughter was healed at that moment. But here is what I want you to hold on to, because we are not done with that word from Jesus. That phrase, great faith, is one of the most specific compliments in all of Matthew's Gospel. He does not give it out freely. In fact, if you go through all of Matthew, that exact phrase, megale pistis, appears only twice, once here and once in chapter 8, when a Roman centurion, another complete outsider, another Gentile without a covenant claim, walks up to Jesus and says something that stops Jesus in his tracks. In both cases, the person with the greatest faith in the story is not Jewish. They are outsiders, people with no official standing, no inherited membership, no credentials. Matthew is building something, and we are going to follow it to its end. But first, we have to deal with the question that has been sitting in the room since the beginning of this conversation. Was Jesus testing her? This is the question that has divided scholars and preachers and ordinary readers for 2,000 years. And the reason it matters so much is that the answer changes the entire moral character of the story. If Jesus was testing her, then the silence and the apparent insult were a teacher's tools, deliberate, controlled, aimed at revealing something she already possessed, a performance of rejection designed to make her faith visible. If Jesus was not testing her, then something stranger and more uncomfortable was happening, something that touches the deepest questions about who Jesus was and what the incarnation actually means. Let me give you all three major positions, because each one reveals something true. The first and oldest interpretation is what most traditional Christian theology has settled on. Jesus knew all along that he would heal her daughter. The entire exchange was orchestrated. The silence was designed. The dog comment was a setup. He was waiting to see if her faith was real enough, stubborn enough, theologically sharp enough to argue its way through. On this reading, the disciples are the real audience for this lesson. They wanted her dismissed. They saw a noisy, foreign, religiously unqualified woman, and their first instinct was to get her out of the way. Jesus lets the encounter play out, not primarily for her sake, but to show his inner circle what they have been missing. She out-argues them, she out-faiths them, and they are the ones who should be ashamed. There is strong evidence for this reading. The tone Jesus uses in verse 28, the word he uses for woman, is the same respectful term he uses when speaking to his own mother from the cross. Not cold, not dismissive. Warm. That is not the tone of someone who genuinely wanted this woman to go away. But there is a second reading, and it is the one that makes people genuinely uncomfortable. On this reading, Jesus was not performing. He came to that region to rest, not to heal. His mission, at this point in his ministry, was genuinely focused on Israel. He said so, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." Those words were not a test. They were true. And then this woman's argument shifted something. Her theology was precise. Her use of the domestic image was not sentimental. It was rooted in exactly the kind of covenant logic that Jesus himself had been teaching. She took his own framework and pressed it to a conclusion he had not yet reached. And he followed her there. This interpretation is uncomfortable because it implies that Jesus, in this moment, was in some way limited. That a Gentile woman moved the boundary of his mission through the quality of her argument. But the people who hold this position say it actually honors the incarnation more deeply than the test theory does, because the incarnation is not a performance. God becoming human means God actually becoming human, embedded in a body, in a culture, in a history, learning the way humans learn, growing the way humans grow. Luke 2:52 says explicitly, Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature. If that growth was real during his childhood, why would it stop when his ministry began? Maybe the encounter with this woman was one of the moments it continued, and if that is true, then this woman is not a prop in a lesson. She is a participant in the revelation. Her argument becomes part of the story of how the gospel expanded to include everyone, including us. Now hold both of those readings, because there is a third one, and it comes from scholars working specifically in first-century rhetorical contexts. On this reading, what looks like a refusal to us looked like something completely different to the original audience. In the rabbinic tradition of the first century, there was a recognized form of dialogue in which a teacher would present an objection to test the seriousness and depth of a petitioner's request. The objection was not the final word. It was an opening move. It was an invitation to push back. And the quality of your response determined whether your request would be granted. This was not unusual. It was a known format. A teacher who simply granted every request without challenge was not doing their job. The challenge was part of the pedagogy. The disciples did not understand this. They saw the objection and read it as a shut door. They wanted to escort the woman out before things got more awkward. She understood it. She heard the objection and recognized it as an opening. She walked through it with an argument so precise that Jesus acknowledged it immediately, not reluctantly, but with what sounds very much like genuine admiration. Woman, great faith. Your request is granted. 3 readings, each one illuminating something true. We are going to hold all 3 of them as we go deeper, because the real power of this story lives in the tension between them. But right now, I want to show you something about the structure of Matthew's Gospel that most people reading this story in isolation completely miss. The Canaanite woman's story is not an island. Matthew placed it in a specific location in his Gospel for specific reasons, and once you see the architecture around it, the story becomes 3 times larger than it first appeared. Here is the sequence Matthew builds in chapter 15. First, the argument with the Pharisees about ritual purity. Jesus dismantles the entire clean and unclean framework that separated Israel from the Gentile world. He says it is not what goes into a person that defiles them. He is pulling the boundary down. Second, immediately after making that argument, Jesus walks into Gentile territory. He does not just teach about the boundary, he crosses it. And the first person he encounters there is the most multiply unclean person imaginable by the standards he just rejected. A foreign woman, a Canaanite, screaming in public. Every box that the Pharisee system would have marked as defiled, and she has more faith than anyone he has encountered in Israel. Third, after this encounter, Matthew tells us Jesus goes up a mountain near the Sea of Galilee, and enormous crowds come to him, the lame, the blind, the mute, the crippled, and he heals them all. And they praise, in Matthew's specific language, the God of Israel. Commentators have noted for centuries that this phrasing is strange if the crowd is Jewish. You do not praise the God of Israel as if it is a new discovery, if that is already your God. That language is the language of people encountering something for the first time. This is a Gentile crowd. And then Jesus feeds them, 4,000 people, with 7 loaves and a few fish. Now go back to chapter 14. What did Jesus do there, in Jewish territory? He fed 5,000 people, with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Matthew is showing us a parallel. The same act of feeding, first for Israel, then for the nations, first inside the covenant, then outside. And between those 2 feedings, standing at the hinge between them, is this woman. Her argument about the crumbs does not just win her daughter's healing. It opens the door to a feast for thousands. There is a word that ties all of this together. It is the Greek word artos, bread. The children's bread in the conversation, the 7 loaves at the feeding of the 4,000, the bread broken at the Last Supper, the bread that Jesus calls himself in John's Gospel, where he says, "I am the bread of life," and then immediately says, "and the bread that I will give for the life of the world." The world, not just Israel. Matthew is building a single argument across chapters, and this woman is a load-bearing wall in that argument. The bread was always for everyone, but it required someone with enough faith and enough theological precision to argue for it. She made that argument, and now we need to talk about who she actually was, because the way this woman has been treated in the history of Christian reading says something uncomfortable about how the tradition has dealt with the people it most needed to hear from. We do not know her name. In 2,000 years of Christian tradition, people have tried to give her one. Some traditions call her Justa, some Syrophenissa. None of those names appear in any text. Matthew and Mark both leave her anonymous. That anonymity is itself meaningful. Matthew is not interested in her as an individual story. He is interested in what she represents. The unnamed outsider who argued her way into the story of salvation. But she is, despite that anonymity, one of the most fully realized figures in the entire gospel narrative. We know how she sounds: desperate, urgent, not willing to be polite about it. We know how she thinks, precisely, quickly, without panic. We know what she believes. She believes that the God of Israel is real and that this man can reach her daughter. We know what she loves, her child, with everything. And we know what she was willing to risk, because this was not a safe thing to do. She was in her own territory, yes, but she was approaching a foreign religious teacher in a public setting, demanding his attention, refusing to accept his initial response. In the social world of the first century, women did not do this. Full stop. The disciples' discomfort was not cruelty. It was a reflection of how profoundly she was violating the expected script. She was not supposed to be there. She was not supposed to argue. She was definitely not supposed to win. She won anyway, and I want to dwell on that for a moment, because the disciples in this story are often treated as secondary characters, bystanders who wanted her dismissed and got shown up. But if you look at their reaction carefully, something more interesting is happening. These are men who have been with Jesus for a substantial portion of his ministry at this point in Matthew's Gospel. They have watched him heal a Roman centurion's servant. They have seen him calm a storm. They have been sent out in pairs with authority to heal diseases and cast out demons. They have just fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. They have, by any reasonable measure, more evidence about who Jesus is than virtually any other human beings alive. And their instinct, when this woman shows up, is to protect their boundaries, to maintain order, to define who is in and who is out, and to enforce that definition by getting Jesus to dismiss her. They are doing what people with insider status always do. They are managing the access. She does not have access. She does not have status. She has nothing except an argument and a need. And she uses both of them better than the people who have everything. The first will be last, and the last will be first. Jesus says that in Matthew 19, the very next chapter. It is not a coincidence that Matthew places it there. He has just shown us the most vivid possible illustration of it. But there is one more layer here, one that the disciples' failure makes visible, and it is the one that has haunted the church for its entire history. The disciples wanted to dismiss her. The church, across 2,000 years, has repeated that instinct in ways large and small, toward women, toward foreigners, toward people whose faith looked and sounded different from what was expected. This story is not just a historical record, it is a mirror. Every time the church has said to someone, "This is not for you, this is only for us, you do not have the right credentials, you are not the right kind of person," it has been in the position of the disciples. And every time someone has argued back, found the crack in the exclusion, refused to accept the dismissal, and pressed through on the basis of nothing except need and faith, they have been in the position of this woman. Now let's go back to the hardest line. I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. We cannot avoid this. It is too important. Because it is not just a test script line that Jesus is running through before revealing his real position. It is, or at least it appears to be, a genuine statement about the scope of his mission. And it sits in direct tension with the last words of Matthew's Gospel, which are explicitly universal. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. How do we get from one to the other? Theologians have worked on this question for 2,000 years, and I want to give you the full map of where the serious thinking has landed, because this is not a settled question, and the way you answer it shapes how you understand not just this story, but the entire Gospel. The oldest and still most widely held position is what scholars call salvation historical sequencing. The idea is that God's redemptive work in history has always moved outward in expanding circles. It began with one person, Abraham. It expanded to a family, then a tribe, then a nation. It was always intended to reach all nations. That is the explicit promise given to Abraham in Genesis 12. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. But it moved through Israel first, because Israel was the vehicle, the covenant community through whom the blessing would eventually flow outward. On this reading, Jesus saying, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel," is not a limitation. It is a description of where the mission is in that moment. He is operating within the divinely ordered sequence, Israel first, then the world. The Canaanite woman's encounter is a preview, an early crack in the door that will be fully opened after the resurrection. This is a coherent reading, and it has the advantage of making Jesus' words and actions completely consistent across the Gospel. But there is a second position that has gained significant ground in the last century, particularly among scholars taking the humanity of the Incarnation seriously. And it begins from a simple question: what does it actually mean for God to become human? Not to take on a human costume, not to operate inside a human body while remaining fundamentally divine and unaffected by the limitations of that body, but to actually become human, to be born into a specific body, a specific culture, a specific moment in history, to think in Aramaic, to pray the Psalms that every Jewish child prayed, to be shaped by the stories, the expectations, the wounds, and the hopes of first-century Jewish Galilee. If the Incarnation was real, then Jesus' understanding of his own mission was shaped by the world he was born into. He did not arrive with a complete download of all future implications already installed. He learned, he grew. Luke says so explicitly, and if that is true, then the encounter with this woman may be one of the moments where the scope of his mission became clearer, where a Gentile woman's argument pressed his own theological framework further than he had yet pressed it himself. She did not change his theology, she completed it. She took the covenant logic he had inherited and taught the universal promise to Abraham, the Psalms that spoke of all nations praising God, the prophets who had envisioned light to the Gentiles, and she pressed him to follow that logic all the way to its conclusion. He followed, and it is worth sitting with what that means if it is true. It means that this unnamed woman from the coast of Phoenicia is not just a recipient of grace. She is a participant in the revelation. Her stubbornness, her precision, her refusal to accept a no that she knew was not the final word, these become part of the story of how the gospel expanded to include everyone who would come after her, including every person watching this video right now. That is not a small thing. Now I want to take you through something that most videos about this passage completely skip, and it is the reason that this story has been generating new readings for 2,000 years, rather than settling into a fixed interpretation. Let me walk you through how 4 of the greatest theological minds in Christian history read this exact passage. And I want to show you not just what they concluded, but why their different conclusions reveal something important about the story itself. The first is Augustine of Hippo. He wrote in the 4th century, and he came to this passage as someone who had spent decades thinking about the relationship between the Church and Israel, and about the mystery of why God's grace sometimes seems hidden or delayed. For Augustine, the Canaanite woman is not primarily a historical individual. She is a figure. She represents the Gentile church, the whole church of the nations, coming to Christ from outside the covenant, having no inherited claim, possessed of nothing but desperate need and stubborn faith. Her initial rejection, in Augustine's reading, is the experience of the church in history. God seems absent. Prayer seems to hit a ceiling. The silence stretches out. And the question is whether faith will hold through the silence or whether it will collapse. She holds. The church holds. And what felt like rejection turns out to have been preparation. Augustine used this passage specifically to comfort people who felt their prayers were not being heard. He said, "Look at her." She kept going. The apparent rejection was not the end of the story. It was the test before the answer. The second reader is John Chrysostom, writing around the same time as Augustine. And Chrysostom noticed something that Augustine missed entirely, or at least did not emphasize. He noticed the progression of her address. She starts by calling Jesus Son of David. That is a specifically Jewish messianic title. She is claiming a connection through that title to the covenant history of Israel. She is saying, "I know who you are within your own tradition." But then she kneels, and she doesn't say Son of David again. She says simply, Lord. Chrysostom read this as a movement in her faith. She entered the encounter invoking Jesus through a particular ethnic and historical identity. She left it addressing him as something more universal, Lord, the title that transcends ethnicity, the title that belongs to everyone. Her faith, in other words, grew during the encounter. She arrived understanding Jesus through a Jewish lens. She departed understanding him through a universal one. For Chrysostom, that movement is the whole point. This is not just a story about a woman who got what she needed. It is a story about what faith looks like when it is willing to go deeper than the category it started with. The third reader is Martin Luther, and his engagement with this passage is the most emotionally raw of any major theologian in the tradition. Luther wrote a sermon on this text in the 1520s during a period when he was himself navigating what felt like prolonged divine silence. His movement was under pressure. His theology was under attack. And in this woman's story, he found something he needed personally. He called the Canaanite woman's encounter the greatest trial of faith in the entire New Testament, not the disciples on the stormy sea, not Gethsemane. This. Because, Luther argued, what makes faith genuinely hard is not suffering. Suffering is survivable. What makes faith genuinely hard is when God appears to say no, when the silence is not just absence but apparent refusal, when the very scripture that promises grace seems to be deployed against you, when the answer to Lord help me is the children's bread is not for dogs. Luther said that in that moment, every human instinct says, then God does not want to help me, then I should stop asking. Then the answer is no. And this woman's genius in Luther's reading is that she refused to accept that logic. She found, underneath the apparent rejection, a promise she could hold on to. Even dogs eat the crumbs. Even the no contains a yes, if you are willing to press far enough into it. Luther used her as a model specifically for people in spiritual crisis, people who feel that God has turned away from them, people whose prayers have been hitting a wall for years, people who have been given every reason to give up. He said, do not give up. Do not accept the apparent no as the final word. Keep pressing. Find the crack in the argument. Walk through it. The fourth voice I want to bring into this conversation is not a single theologian, but a whole generation of contemporary scholars, particularly those working in feminist and post-colonial approaches to biblical interpretation. And they have said something that the earlier tradition, with its focus on the theological argument, largely missed. They have said, this woman had a name. She had a life. She had a daughter who was suffering. She was a specific person from a specific place with specific stakes in this encounter. And the tradition's tendency to turn her immediately into a symbol or a figure or a model of generic faith has, in its own way, repeated the disciples' error of treating her as something other than a full human being whose individual story mattered. They have also pointed out that this story, placed within the larger history of Christianity, carries a particular weight for every person who has been told by the church that the bread is not for them. Women who were barred from ministry, non-Western Christians whose cultures were treated as defiled, indigenous people whose own traditions were dismissed as worthless, LGBTQ believers who were told to stand outside while others ate. For all of them, this woman's story is not abstract theology. It is a template. You do not have to have the right credentials. You do not have to come through the approved door. You do not have to accept the boundaries that insiders want to enforce. You find the crack. You press through it. Her argument wins not because she changed the rules. She found the logic already inside the rules and followed it further than anyone else was willing to go. There is a detail in the story that almost no commentary I have read dwells on, and I want to spend time on it, because I think it is the emotional center of everything. Her daughter is not there. This woman is not standing in front of Jesus holding her sick child. She is not presenting the suffering directly. She is arguing for someone who is not in the room, someone she cannot produce as evidence, someone whose condition she can only describe. And she is asking for a miracle at a distance, for a person she cannot bring to the scene, based on nothing except her own word and her own faith. Jesus healed at a distance before this. In Matthew 8, the Roman centurion asks Jesus to heal his servant without Jesus having to come to the house. Jesus grants it. He marvels at the faith and heals from a distance. But the centurion had a kind of authority. He understood command structures. He presented his request through a recognizable frame of power and delegation. This woman has nothing like that. She has no authority. She has no frame of power. She has a sick child she cannot bring, and a request she has no official basis to make. And she makes it anyway. And she argues for it with precision and tenacity. And she wins it. At that moment, Matthew says, the daughter was healed at that moment, not gradually, not eventually, not after some period of recovery. At the exact moment her argument was honored across whatever distance separated that road from her home, her daughter was healed. Two people in relationship, a mother and a daughter, one of them fighting for the other in the only place she could fight. The other receiving something she did not know was being won for her. I do not think it is an accident that Matthew chose to give us that detail at that moment, because it is not just a satisfying narrative resolution. It is a theological statement about what prayer actually is. It is one person pressing into the mercy of God on behalf of someone who cannot press for themselves. It is intercession in its most stripped-down form. No ceremony, no formula, no institutional backing. Just a mother on her knees saying, "Lord, help me," and refusing to stop. And it works. We are coming toward the end of this story, but before we land, I want to give you the question that this passage leaves open, because I think it is the most honest ending to this conversation. The question is, where are you in this story? Not as a rhetorical device, as a genuine question, because there are four distinct positions in this scene, and most of us move between all of them at different points in our lives. There are the Pharisees, who are not in this particular story but whose logic saturates it, the people who have built their faith around knowing who is in and who is out, who are clean and who are not, whose credentials are valid and whose are not. The people for whom faith is primarily about maintaining the right boundaries. There are the disciples, who are in the story and whose failure is quiet and human and recognizable. They are not malicious, they are tired, they are managing, they are trying to protect something, and in protecting it, they almost miss the most extraordinary moment they have witnessed. There is Jesus, who either tests or is challenged or engages in a known rhetorical form, depending on which reading you find most honest, but who ends the encounter with unambiguous honor for this woman. Whatever was happening in his silence, his final words are clear. Great faith, your request is granted. And there is the woman, who had every reason to leave, who had been ignored, compared to an animal, implicitly told she was outside the scope of what was being offered, who had a sick daughter at home that nobody else was fighting for, and who sat down in the wreckage of every apparent rejection and found, inside the metaphor that seemed to exclude her, a reason to stay. The crumbs. Even the dogs get the crumbs. She did not ask for the whole table. She asked for what falls. And what she received was her daughter, whole and healed, at that moment. There is a question underneath this that I think the story wants us to carry away. When the door appears to be closed, do you leave, or do you look for the crack? When the silence stretches out and the apparent answer is no, do you accept that as the final word? Or do you do what this woman did, which is take the no apart, find the logic inside it, and follow that logic somewhere the no did not intend to go? Faith in this story is not passive. It is not quiet. It is not polite. It is a Canaanite woman screaming on a road, refusing to be dismissed, and arguing her way through a door that everyone around her agreed was shut. And the answer comes at that moment. If this story has opened something for you, there is a passage in Luke that goes even deeper into this question of persistent prayer and apparent divine silence. In Luke chapter 18, Jesus tells a parable specifically about this. He tells it, Luke says, to the end that people ought always to pray and not lose heart. The parable is about a widow who keeps coming to an unjust judge with a single request. He ignores her. She keeps coming. He ignores her again. She keeps coming. And eventually, not because he is just or righteous, but simply because of her relentless persistence, he grants her request. Jesus tells that parable and then asks, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? The question implies that persistent faith, the refusal to accept silence as the final answer, is rare, rarer than we think. The Canaanite woman has it. The widow in the parable has it. That video is on screen right now. And if you want to stay inside Matthew's Gospel, the argument in chapter 15 that comes directly before this encounter, Jesus' confrontation with the Pharisees about what actually defiles a person, is the theological foundation that makes this whole story possible. Without that argument, the Canaanite woman's victory makes no sense. Once you see how they connect, Matthew's architecture becomes extraordinary. That breakdown is coming next. Subscribe so you don't miss it.